In the grainy newsreels of India's freedom struggle, one face is everywhere. Jawaharlal Nehru, elegant in his achkan, raising the tricolor into the smoky Delhi sky. Almost no camera lingers on the thin, bearded man in simple khadi, drilling rows of young volunteers in dusty playgrounds under a saffron flag. And yet for millions it was this forgotten figure, Madhav Sadashiv Golwalkar, who would quietly shape their idea of what India should be long after the speeches in Parliament had faded. On a humid night in 1940, a third-class train rattles across central India. The carriage is crowded, the air thick with sweat, coal dust, and the sour smell of brass tiffin boxes. On the wooden bench by the window sits a bespectacled 34-year-old man, clutching a crumpled telegram. Return to Nagpur immediately, no delay. Hedge war. It's not just another summons. By the time this train reaches Nagpur, the founder of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, Dr. Keshav Baliram Hedgewar, may be dead. And within 24 hours, this quiet zoology teacher will be forced to choose a secure future in academia or the dangerous, uncertain path of leading a secretive, much-hated, rapidly growing organization that sees itself as the soul of a wounded civilization. Outside, on station walls, bright posters show a different India in the making. Nehru's sharp profile above the words, Purna Swaraj, complete independence. Crowds argue about the Congress, about Gandhi's next fast. None of them know that, in the shadows, another vision of India is gathering discipline and numbers, and that this man on the wooden bench will soon become its most powerful architect. Before he was Guruji, before he was feared, admired, accused, and mythologized, he was simply Madhav, a frail boy in a small town where the British Empire felt as permanent as the summer heat. Madhav Sadashiv Golwalkar was born on 19th of February 1906 in the little town of Ramtek, near Nagpur. Ramtek, with its ancient temple on a hill and sleepy lanes, was a place where myth and dust mixed easily. Pilgrims climbed barefoot to the shrine, reciting verses older than the Mughals, older than the British, older than memory itself. His father, Sadashiv Rao, was a schoolteacher, stern but deeply devout. His mother, Lakshmi Bai, was gentle, often sick, her thin hands smelling of turmeric and incense. The family was poor but not desperate, a Brahmin household clinging fiercely to education as its only real wealth. There was nothing at first glance to suggest that this boy would one day lock horns, in absentia, with Nehru over the very meaning of nation. As a child, Madhav was painfully shy. Other boys ran through the lanes shouting, wrestling, stealing mangoes from orchards. He preferred corners and books, crouched under dim lamps, tracing letters with a concentration that bordered on obsession. He loved stories, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, legends of forgotten kingdoms. But it wasn't the battles that caught him first. It was the idea that a whole people could rise or fall depending on the strength of a few determined minds. Then the empire's shadow darkened his small world. Ramtek, like much of India, lived under the constant, quiet violence of colonial rule. The Union Jack above the Tehsil office, the white officer swaying on a horse while villagers stood aside in the dust. These were fixtures of everyday life. But sometimes that quiet violence turned suddenly visible. In one bitter season, disease swept through the town. Cholera. Bodies burned on the ghats almost every day. The smoke hung low over the water. The British administration reacted not with compassion but with orders. Whole lanes were cordoned off. Homes were entered without warning. A coughing child could mean your house would be marked with white paint and quarantined like a contaminated stable. Young Madhav watched his father argue, helpless, with a uniformed officer about medicines, about support for the sick. He saw even more clearly the way people in the town lowered their eyes when the officer spoke, their backs bending a little more than necessary. Somewhere in that boy's mind, a silent question formed. How did a civilization that built these temples, these stories, this vast web of meaning, come to this? Bent, afraid, taking orders. When he was still small, the family moved to Nagpur. If Ramtek was a pond, Nagpur felt like a crowded, restless river. Cotton mills, markets, government offices. And bubbling under it all, something new, politics. By his early teens, Madhav had discovered that he was fast, not with his fists, but with his mind. At school, he devoured textbooks and finished them months before exams. Teachers noticed the boy who seemed to vanish into a world of numbers and diagrams and then emerge with perfect answers, as if from somewhere far away. He listened closely when older boys whispered about Lokmanya Tilak, about Swaraj is my birthright. Newspapers carried stories that felt like punches, protests brutally suppressed, leaders jailed. Then in 1919 came a word that would haunt the country, Jallianwala Bagh. The massacre happened hundreds of kilometers away in Amritsar. But in Nagpur, in a cramped common room of a school hostel, boys unfolded a newspaper and stared at a grainy photograph of a walled garden. General Dyer had ordered his soldiers to fire into the unarmed crowd, trapped in that garden until their ammunition was almost exhausted. Hundreds killed, thousands injured. Blood in the dust where children had been playing. Madhav read the report again and again. He imagined himself in that garden, no exit, the deafening crack of rifles, the screams. Something shifted inside his quiet, disciplined mind. Until then, the empire had been an unjust fact, like the summer heat, oppressive but almost natural. After Jallianwala, it became obscene. But if Jallianwala lit the flame of anger, another influence gave it direction. In a corner of the school library, under a thin film of dust, he found writings of Swami Vivekananda. Here was a different tone from the timid essays he'd read in English textbooks. A voice that said, "Take pride. Stand straight. Your civilization is not a footnote to Europe. It is a force." Vivekananda's words were a revelation. The idea that spiritual strength and national strength were intertwined burned into him. He began to see India not just as a political territory under foreign rule, but as a vast, ancient organism that had somehow fallen, ill and needed a cure from within. Yet, even as nationalist emotion stirred, Madhav's first love remained study. He enrolled in Hislop College in Nagpur, an institution shaped by Western missionaries but increasingly filled with young Indians restless for change. There, in laboratories smelling of formalin and chalk, he plunged into science, especially zoology. The same intensity with which he'd read epics, he now turned on microscopes and specimens. How did life organize itself? How did countless cells function in unison to form a single body? He did not yet know that this way of thinking, about organisms' unity and function, would later color his vision of society itself. College also brought him face to face with his first real competitor. Let's call him Rahul Deshmukh. A fictional name, but very real as a type, as a force. The polished, English-speaking, Congress-leaning student leader with a quick smile and quicker words. Rahul was everything Madhav outwardly was not. Confident, charismatic, loud in debates, he quoted Rousseau and Mill, teased British professors to their faces, spoke of democracy, socialism, of an India where Hindus and Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians would share power equally under a modern constitution. In packed college halls, when Rahul stood to speak, chairs would scrape, boys would lean forward. "We must build a nation where religion stays at home and progress walks in the streets," he would say, and applause would follow. Madhav, thin and withdrawn, listened from the back rows. But sometimes when he rose to ask a question, the hall would fall oddly quiet. His English wasn't as polished. His sentences were slower, searching for precise words. Yet behind them was a different steel. "If religion is kept only at home," he once asked after Rahul's fiery speech, "what gives the home its meaning? What is the glue that holds people together when the state fails? A constitution is a document. A nation is something more." There was a tension between them that went beyond marks and medals. It was a rivalry between two visions that would eventually tear through India's politics. A secular, constitutional nationalism and a cultural, civilizational nationalism. In college, it was just two students arguing. Neither yet guessed how enormous the stakes would become. Around this time, a short, intense man with piercing eyes began appearing on Nagpur's fringes, gathering small groups of boys in open grounds at dawn and dusk. His name was Keshav Baliram Hedgewar. Where Congress meetings were loud, public, glorious in their defiance of British rule, Hedgewar's gatherings were almost invisible. No banners, no speeches in English, no grand resolutions. Just a whistle, a saffron flag, and lines of boys in simple clothes, doing drills, singing songs, listening to stories of heroes not found in British textbooks. Someone told Madhav about these strange shakas. Curious, he walked one evening to a dusty ground on the city's edge. The scene he encountered would never leave his mind. The sun was bleeding out behind the trees. A cheap tin whistle shrilled. A saffron flag fluttered on a bamboo pole, its color stark against the darkening sky. Around it, in neat lines, boys stood absolutely still, eyes forward, chests out, wooden sticks held firmly. No British officer, no inspector. Just this flag and a kind of silent, self-imposed discipline. Hedgewar himself was not physically imposing, but when he spoke, even casually, there was a compressed energy in his words. He didn't talk about petitions to the British. He talked about character, about a Hindu society that had forgotten its strength, lost in caste disputes, in imitation of the West, in fear. "We shout Vande Mataram on the streets," he said one evening, his voice low, measured. "But when a neighbor is in trouble, do we stand by him? When there is a riot, do we protect our own? Freedom is not won by slogans alone. It is won when every man is trained, organized, and ready." For Madhav, this was like Vivekananda, but given legs and lungs. Here was an organization that didn't just preach pride, it drilled it, line by line, into young bodies. No one asked your surname before standing next to you in formation. Yet it was also unmistakably Hindu in its symbolism and worldview, where Rahul saw salvation in institutions, parliaments, courts, elections. Hedgewar and increasingly Madhav saw salvation in society itself, a disciplined, unified mass of people who thought of themselves as one ancient family. The rivalry sharpened. At Hislop, Rahul mocked the RSS Shakas as brown shirt play acting, dangerous mimicry of European extremism. Madhav flinched at the comparison, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Rahul's tidy, secular dreams felt thin, almost weightless, out against the raw loyalty he felt among Swayamsevaks circling that saffron flag. On some evenings, he would attend Congress-style student meetings, listening to patriotic songs, speeches against British laws, calls for civil disobedience. On others, he would slip away quietly to the Shaka ground, tie his simple belt, lift his stick, and join the drills. It felt like living in two different Indias at once. All this happened under a ticking clock no one could hear. By the late 1920s, the British were tightening and loosening their grip in alternating bursts. New laws, new promises, new betrayals. Gandhi launched movements, then called them off. Nehru's star was rising. The dream of freedom seemed at once close and impossibly far. For Madhav personally, another countdown had started. His talent in zoology had not gone unnoticed. He completed his studies with distinction, and in a country where educated unemployment was a specter haunting so many homes, he was offered what his parents considered a miracle, a chance to teach and do research at the prestigious Banaras Hindu University. It was everything a young man from a modest family could hope for: a stable income, status, the thrill of scientific discovery, a path that might lead, in time, to professorship, to recognition in journals beyond India's borders. When the letter of appointment arrived, his father's hand shook as he held it. His mother lit incense, whispering thanks. Nagpur's dust receded behind him as he arrived in Banaras, that strange city where death and devotion walked side by side along the Ganga. In BHU's red brick buildings and manicured lawns, he entered a different world. Structured timetables, well-stocked laboratories, students hungry to learn. In the bright light of those labs, bending over dissected specimens, he tasted a different kind of power. The power of knowledge to explain, to predict, to control. Cells under the lens did not lie or argue. They simply were. Orderly, comprehensible. Yet even here in the cloistered world of academia, India's struggles seeped in. On hostile walls, posters announced visits by Nehru, by Subhas Chandra Bose, by other Congress stars. Students marched through the campus shouting slogans. At tea stalls, heated arguments erupted. Was Gandhi's nonviolence too slow? Was revolution justified? What about the rights of Muslims, of Dalits? Madhav listened more than he spoke, but he could feel a tension stretching inside him, nearly to breaking point. Letters from Nagpur told him how the RSS was growing. More shakas, more boys, more hunger for organization. Hedgewar himself wrote occasionally in a blunt, affectionate tone, asking after his health, his work, and gently probing, "When will you return to serve full-time?" Between microscope and saffron flag, he was being forced to choose. In Banaras, the figure of Nehru loomed larger than ever, elegant, Western-educated, speaking in long, flowing sentences about socialism, industrialization, democracy. Newspapers hailed him as the future face of India. Students adored him. He was, in a sense, Rahul Deshmukh scaled up to a national level. Sometimes, as Madhav walked back to his room after a long day in the lab, he would hear cheering from the main road, a Nehru procession. Passing by, white caps bobbing around a car. He would stop and watch from a distance. There, in that shining car, was one version of the future, an India lit up by factories and parliamentary debates, citizens first, communities second. Inside Madhav's chest, a quieter but no less stubborn vision beat its wings, an India where the deep ancient identity of the majority would be forged into a disciplined force, unquestionably cohesive. The rivalry that had started in a college debate hall had become something much larger, a battle, still mostly invisible, for the soul of a nation rushing toward freedom. Time for both visions was running out. For the British, dark clouds were gathering in Europe. War loomed. The empire's attention would soon be divided, its resources stretched. Inside India, this meant opportunity and danger. Repression could come suddenly, brutally, without warning. In 1931, after months of inner struggle, the clock inside Madhav seemed to strike. He looked at the neat rows of specimen jars in the lab, at the blackboard covered with half-erased diagrams, at the quiet corridors of BHU. Then he thought of Nagpur's dusty grounds, of boys standing straight under a fading sun, of Hedgewar's burning eyes. He resigned his academic post. To his colleagues, it was madness. To walk away from science, from a secure position, into the arms of a small controversial organization without recognition, without legal power, without even a clear political program, it felt like choosing fog over stone. But to Madhav, the decision once made felt inevitable. "You're wasting your brilliance on games of sticks and flags," a former professor told him in a last desperate attempt to change his mind. Madhav's answer was soft, stubborn. "In the lab, I study organisms. In Nagpur, I will help build one." He did not say the rest aloud. And one day, that organism will stand face to face with the shining Western-style nation that Nehru dreams of. Only one of us can truly define what India is. He returned to Nagpur as a pracharak, a full-time worker of the RSS, unmarried, unpaid, his life now bound completely to the organization's growth. Days blurred into a relentless routine of travel, meetings, shakas, quiet conversations in tea shops and temple courtyards. He slept on thin mattresses in strangers' homes, carried his world in a single cloth bag. The man who once peered at cells through glass now peered at society through train windows, village after village, town after town. He saw the poverty newspapers only hinted at, ribs like cages, eyes like empty lamps. He saw also the deep cultural continuity, the same stories, the same gods, the same rituals linking people who could barely afford a meal. All of this only confirmed his conviction. This ancient shared culture was the only real strength India possessed. If it could be awakened, organized, disciplined, nothing could stop it. Not the British, not the glittering appeal of Nehruvian modernity, not the separatist dreams of those who demanded a nation within a nation. And then came the telegram. "Return to Nagpur immediately, no delay." Hedgewar. In the rattling third-class compartment, with hours ticking away to dawn, Madhav stared out at the darkness beyond the window. He knew what this might mean. Hedgewar had been ill for months. The organization he had built from nothing now stretched across provinces, fragile but growing. Someone would have to lead it next. Madhav was young, unmarried. Brilliant, yes, but also controversial within the ranks. Some older workers distrusted his intensity, his sharp, uncompromising ideas. Others saw in him exactly what the organization needed to face the stormy years ahead. With war, repression, and freedom all hurtling toward India at once, the train screamed into the night. Every station it passed, every mile of track left behind, brought him closer not only to Nagpur, not only to Hedgewar's sickbed, but to the point where his path would finally intersect, in full force, with Nehru's, not in a handshake, but in a clash of futures. Dawn began to smudge the horizon. The carriage stirred. Someone lit a beedi. A baby cried. Madhav folded the telegram carefully as if it were something sacred and slipped it into his pocket. Nagpur was only a few hours away. Time, for him, for the RSS, for their rival visions of India, was about to speed up. By the time Jawaharlal Nehru would stand on the ramparts of the Red Fort, silk rose in his buttonhole and the world's cameras clicking. Another transfer of power had already taken place in a cramped Nagpur house with peeling limewash, one flickering lantern, and no journalists at all. In Delhi, the future of a state was being prepared. In Nagpur, over the course of 48 hours, the future of a counter-nation was being born, and almost nobody outside a tight circle of men in khadi even knew it was happening. The train screeched into Nagpur at dawn. Madhav stepped down onto the platform with a cotton bag, the telegram, and a feeling like a stone in his chest. Nagpur's familiar smells, coal smoke, dust, frying poha from a stall, felt strangely distant, as if he were walking through someone else's memory. He didn't go home. He went straight to Hedgewar's house. The lane was already crowded. Men in simple white dhotis, some with sticks still in hand from early morning drills, stood in tense clusters. No one spoke loudly. The usual crack of jokes, the slap of friendly arguments, all gone. It was as if the whole street was holding its breath. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, camphor, and the low murmur of Sanskrit prayers. On a thin mattress, propped up by pillows, lay the man who had turned empty playgrounds into training grounds, Keshav Balaram Hedgewar. His frame, once wiry and restless, looked shockingly small. Eyes that used to flash with mischief and anger now burned with a different intensity. The fire of a man racing against his own failing body. He motioned weakly. "Come closer, Madhav." Madhav knelt, leaning in to catch each word. He knew, everyone in that house knew, that this might be the last conversation that truly mattered. "You left your science," Hedgewar said, breath-catching. "Not for me, not even for today's shakas. You left it for something much longer. Do you remember what we spoke of? A living Hindu society, organized like an army, feeling like a family." He paused, swallowing pain. "I will not see it. The war in Europe, the British weakening, the storms among Hindus and Muslims, all this is coming. I will not be there." "You will." The words hung in the room like a verdict. Madhav blinked. "But Doktorji, there are so many older, more experienced Prakaraks. There are—" His mind filled with names, men who had been with Hedgewar from the beginning, who knew every village, every quarrel, every song. Hedgewar's gaze hardened, cutting through the fog of illness. "They are good men, but they think in districts, in provinces. You think in centuries, in organisms, in the whole." A faint, almost teasing smile flickered. "And you are not yet worn out." He gripped Madhav's hand suddenly, surprisingly strong. "Within a few years," he whispered, "the British will be forced to go, but they will not leave a vacuum. They will leave behind a state, a constitution, and men like Nehru to run it. Your time to build a counterforce is short. A decade, maybe less. Take it as your vow." It was more than a blessing and less than a command. It was a transfer of burden. Within hours, Hedgewar's breathing grew shallow, the room filled with chanting. Outside, word spread through Nagpur, "Doktorji is dying." He passed away on a gray morning in June 1940. No cannons were fired, no flags were lowered to half-mast. In the British reports filed that day, his name barely appeared, if at all. But in countless towns, in dusty lanes and schoolyards, young men who had learned to stand straighter under a saffron flag felt something inside them collapse, and then slowly harden. A leader was dead. A vacuum had opened. That same day, while Hedgewar's body still lay on the floor for the final rites, a small, intense meeting began in a side room. Senior Prakaraks, some gray-haired, some in their 40s, sat cross-legged on thin mats. The atmosphere was charged, brittle. They knew the movement could easily fracture. Names were proposed, debated, rejected. And then, almost reluctantly, repeatedly, one name kept returning. Madhav Sadashiv Golwalkar, the shy boy from Ramtek, the zoology lecturer, the man who had given up a university career to sleep on train benches and strangers' floors, the one Hedgewar had quietly leaned on in his final years for strategy, for direction, for ideology. There was resistance. "He's too young," one senior said, voice tight. "Barely in his 30s. No family, no political contacts, no experience with the British. The Congress has giants. Gandhi, Nehru, Patel. We will put this boy against that storm." Another frowned. "And he is uncompromising. He doesn't flatter. He doesn't bend. Will people follow such a hard shape for long?" But then someone older, quieter, spoke up. "Hedgewar chose him. That means he saw not just today, but 20, 30 years ahead." By evening, the debate ended. In a dim room by the light of a single oil lamp, Madhav, now increasingly called Guruji by those who felt his teacher's aura, was informed. The mantle of Sarsang Chalak, the supreme guide of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, was his. He did not leap with joy. There was no triumph in his face. If anything, he looked stricken. He had 24 hours to give his answer. That night, lying awake on a thin mattress with mosquito nets hanging limp above him, he felt the ticking of that unseen clock Hedgewar had spoken of. A decade, maybe less, before the Raj collapsed. A decade to turn pockets of disciplined boys into a national organism strong enough to survive not just foreign rule, but the shock of freedom. Could he do it? Part of him longed with an almost physical ache for the quiet certainty of a lab in Benares. Slides, specimens, equations, worlds where cause and effect followed rules that could be written on a blackboard. But outside the open window, he heard the faint echo of a whistle and shouted commands from a distant Shaka ground, where, even in their grief, Swayamsevaks were drilling, lines of young men moving as one, sticks slapping against each other in prescribed patterns. The organism was already pulsing. It needed a brain. Before sunrise, his answer was ready. When the senior workers gathered again, he spoke simply. "If this work is a sadhana," he said, "a sacred discipline, then we do not choose it as one chooses a job. It chooses us. Dr. G has given his verdict. I accept." He was 34 years old. While Nehru was arguing at Congress sessions about the shape of cabinets and negotiating with viceroys, Golwalkar was taking charge of a force that owned no building in Delhi, had no seats in any assembly, and could be shut down by a single government order, yet was already shaping the minds of thousands of young men. From that moment, the rivalry that had once been just a college debate between Madhav and a charismatic student leader like Rahul Deshmukh took on an entirely new scale. Now it was Golwalkar versus Nehru, two Indias moving toward each other like trains on the same track. The world outside was changing at breakneck speed. In Europe, Hitler's armies were on the move. Britain was being bombed. The Second World War had begun. For the empire, India was no longer just a jewel. It was a bunker, a reservoir of soldiers, money, and resources to feed the war machine. In 1939, the viceroy had declared India at war without consulting a single Indian representative. The Congress ministries across provinces resigned in protest. Nehru and his allies debated how far to push confrontation. The Muslim League, under Jinnah, saw an opening to press the case for Pakistan. Amid this chaos, one question hung in the air over every politically active group in India. What will you do about the British war? For the new Sarsang Chalak, the question came with the weight of his own promise to hedge war. Joining the anti-war agitation, defying the Raj openly, would bring instant martyrdom, credibility, the glamour of prison. It would also risk decapitating the RSS before it had properly grown. The British, nervous and ruthless in wartime, would not hesitate to crush what they might see as a paramilitary Hindu formation. The clock was already ticking, not just now in wartime, but toward the unknown hour of independence. Golwalkar made a decision that would brand him to this day in the eyes of many critics. He kept the RSS away from direct confrontation with the British. No politics, he told his men again and again. Our battlefield is society. Our enemy is disunity. Others can fight the British. We will build the strength that will decide what kind of India rises after they leave. Inside, he knew this would be used against them. Cowards, collaborators, armchair patriots. He also knew that if he lost his core cadre to British jails now, the Sangh might never recover. Where Rahul, now a rising Congress organizer, stood on platforms waving and shouting, "British quit India!" Golwalkar stood on uneven village grounds at night, under hurricane lamps, speaking softly about something else entirely, the idea of a Hindu Rashtra, a civilizational nation defined not by borders drawn with rulers on maps, but by a shared cultural DNA. In 1939, as the storm gathered, he did something characteristic and controversial. He wrote a book. Its title was as blunt as a hammer, We, or Our Nationhood Defined. Sitting at rough wooden tables, scribbling by lamplight between journeys, he poured into those pages a synthesis of what he'd drawn from Hindu scriptures, from Vivekananda, from Savarkar, and disturbingly to some from European theorists of the ethnic nation that were in vogue in the 1930s. In its pages, he described Hindus not just as a religious group, but as a nation bound by common blood, culture, and land. Others living in that land, Muslims, Christians, he saw as foreign elements who, if they wish to live in full dignity, must accept Hindu culture as supreme or live as second-class citizens or leave. The language was stark, unflinching. To admirers, it was a battle cry after centuries of humiliation. To opponents, it sounded eerily like the rhetoric rising in fascist Europe. And Rahul, always watching, always ready to pounce, did not miss the chance. In a packed college hall in Nagpur, now crammed with students back from villages where they'd heard of this new book, Rahul held up a copy. "This," he declared, "is not patriotism. This is poison. Europe is already burning because of such ideas. One race, one culture, one nation. Do we want cremation grounds in every street? Or do we want an India where a Pathan from Peshawar and a Tamil Christian from Madras stand equal before the law?" Applause thundered. Someone, emboldened, stood and asked, "But is it not true that Hindus have been attacked, ruled, divided for centuries? Should we not first take care of our own?" Rahul's reply was sharp. "Taking care of your own does not require hating everyone else. If Golwalkar has his way, there will be no India, only ghettos with flags." Word of such attacks reached Golwalkar on his travels. He did not rush to respond in public debates. He rarely even used the word Nehru or Rahul in speeches. Instead, he kept returning to his metaphor, honed in the lab and under the saffron flag, the organism. "A living body has many organs," he would say to young Swayamsevaks listening in the half-dark. "Eyes, ears, hands, heart, all different, all necessary. But if one organ refuses to accept that it belongs to this body, if it insists its loyalty is to another body elsewhere, can that organism survive?" He was not interested in the applause of college halls. He was interested in the slow, almost cellular work of changing how millions thought of themselves. Meanwhile, the war escalated. British intelligence watched every movement with suspicion. In some provinces, local officials tried to restrict the RSS, seeing young men drilling in uniform as a dangerous sign. Orders circulated, inquiries were opened. There were rumors of imminent bans. Inside the organization, the sense of a ticking clock grew sharper. "We have 5 years, at most," one senior Prakarak told Golwalkar during a night train journey, the compartment rattling around them, as men slept on top berths. 5 years before the war ends, the British weaken, and the real fight over India's shape begins. If we don't expand now, we will never catch up with Congress. Golwalkar nodded, eyes reflecting the dim yellow of the compartment bulb. "Then we have no choice," he said calmly. "We must live 5 years in 3. What followed was an almost inhuman schedule. He crisscrossed the country incessantly, from Maharashtra to Punjab, from Bengal to the deep south. He spoke in town squares, in temple courtyards, in the back rooms of traders' homes. He slept a few hours a night, if that. His beard grew fuller, his frame thinner, his eyes brighter with a kind of burning clarity. Those who met him in these years carried away the impression not of a roaring orator, but of a man who could listen with disarming intensity. He would sit on a mud floor with a village teacher, hearing out every complaint about caste arrogance, factional fights, fear of Muslim mobs or arrogant British officials, and then gently pull each personal story into a larger narrative of civilizational recovery. He demanded absolute discipline from his Swayamsevaks. No drinking, no gossip, no using the organization for personal gain. "We are not building a party," he would say. "We are building character." Slowly, something astonishing began to happen. While Congress leaders spent more and more time in and out of British jails, their movements tightly controlled, the RSS staying just on the right side of the law, avoiding open confrontation, spread. New shakas were set up in previously untouched regions. Young men who had once thought only in terms of caste identities, Brahmin, Maratha, Yadav, Kurmi, now shouted, "Bharat Mata Ki Jai," in unison, marching in step. Factory workers in towns joined morning drills before shifts. Students in universities ran shakas in secret corners of campus lawns. Even some British district officers reading dry intelligence summaries were forced to admit a grudging respect. Organization highly disciplined, no open subversive activity, potentially formidable if politicized. Then in 1942, the great test arrived. Gandhi launched the Quit India movement. The call was simple, electric. Do or die. Across the country, protests exploded. Trains were stopped, telegraph wires were cut, police stations were attacked. The British responded with a ferocity learned from suppressing revolts the world over. Within days, the Congress leadership was behind bars. Jails overflowed, bullets tore into crowds. In some districts, the only functioning structured networks left above ground were the colonial bureaucracy and the RSS shakas. Inside the Sangh, pressure built like steam in a sealed boiler. You must give the call, younger Swayamsevaks argued, almost pleading with Golwalkar. If we rise now, we will be seen as true patriots. People are dying in the streets. How can we drill quietly while they bleed? The demand reached fever pitch in some regions. A few shakas even joined protests on their own initiative, inviting local repression. For 72 hours after Gandhi's call, Golwalkar wrestled with the decision. Men crowded outside his temporary residence in a small town, eyes fixed on the door, waiting for a word. If he gave the order, the RSS could be smashed. If he stayed silent, the RSS could be branded a cowardly bystander. On the third night, after long consultations with senior pracharaks, he emerged. His statement was short, almost brutally so. Our discipline, he said, is not for a day or even for freedom from the British alone. We stand for a Hindu society awakened and organized for 1,000 years. We will not expose our structure to destruction by joining unplanned outbursts. Those who wish to join Quit India may do so as individuals. The Sangh, as an organization, will not. In that moment, he chose longevity over glory. Rahul, by now a full-time Congress worker, heard of this with white-hot rage. In a clandestine meeting, held in a darkened room before he himself disappeared into the underground movement, he confronted an RSS worker. Tell your Guruji this, Rahul spat. When history is written, your drills will count for nothing. Those who faced lathis and bullets will own the future. He had a chance to stand with the nation and chose to hide behind philosophy. The irony, as history often loves, was merciless. Rahul was arrested a week later, beaten brutally, and spent years in a British jail. When he emerged, body-scarred but spirit-blazing, he was hailed in his district as a hero. At the same time, Golwalkar, who had never set foot in a British cell, found the RSS, untouched by large-scale crackdown, in a position of quiet, growing strength. While Rahul struggled to rebuild shattered Congress networks, Swayamsevaks were already present, disciplined and numerous, in hundreds of towns. By the mid-1940s, as the war drew to a close and Britain bled itself nearly dry, the speed of events increased dizzyingly. The Muslim League, frustrated with negotiations, escalated its demand. A separate homeland carved out of India. Pakistan moved from slogan to negotiating table. Direct Action Day in 1946 unleashed horrific communal riots, with bodies piled in Calcutta's streets, vultures circling black against a smoky sky. For Golwalkar, the nightmare he had always feared, a civilization carved apart from within, was now less an abstraction and more a calendar item. The British announced their intent to leave. Independence Day had in effect a deadline. Suddenly, time shrank. What Hedgewar had once framed as a decade, maybe less, became a year, maybe less. In meetings late into the night, maps spread out on rough tables, lanterns guttering, Golwalkar and his closest aides tried to calculate the impossible. If partition happens, someone said, finger-tracing vulnerable districts on a dog-eared map, millions of Hindus will be trapped on the wrong side. Trains, caravans, refugees, we will be needed everywhere at once. Another added, voice tight, Congress will control the state machinery, police, army, relief funds. We will have only ourselves. Golwalkar listened, eyes fixed on the map as if trying to will the lines to blur and vanish. We cannot stop partition by ourselves, he said finally, voice colder than usual. But we can decide whether Hindus walk into it like scattered sheep or as an organized body. From tomorrow, no rest. Every shaka must double its efforts. We have 12 months to be ready. Those 12 months were a blur of feverish activity. Swayamsevaks were trained not just in drills but in relief work, how to organize food distribution, guard refugee camps, escort vulnerable families through hostile territory. Secret instructions circulated. In case of riots, protect temples, women, old people first, maintain discipline, do not loot. At the same time, suspicion of the RSS in Congress circles deepened. Some leaders, reading Golwalkar's book and hearing reports of militaristic drills, saw in this growing network not just a social organization, but a potential rival to the authority of the soon-to-be independent state. The Sangh must either accept the Constitution and dissolve its private army, one Congress intellectual fumed in a closed meeting, or it will become our internal enemy number one. Nehru himself, preoccupied with negotiations, industrial plans, and foreign policy, did not yet devote full attention to the RSS, but his ideological distance was clear. In his speeches, he spoke of scientific temper, of ending the mentality of sectarianism. In Golwalkar's quiet gatherings, the talk was of reviving dharmic order and correcting historical wrongs. 2 trains, 2 deadlines, racing toward the same midnight in August 1947. As independence approached, the contradictions sharpened into almost unbearable tension. On 14th of August, in city after city, Congress offices hummed with preparations. Flags were stitched, speeches were polished, fireworks were stacked in courtyards. In Delhi, carpenters hammered final nails into the stands from which leaders would address a free nation for the first time in 2 centuries. In countless RSS shakas, the mood was starkly different. Saffron flags were raised, yes, and songs of freedom sung. But in the same breath, lists were checked. Names of Swayamsevaks assigned to guard incoming refugee trains, to patrol volatile neighborhoods, on to dig mass graves if necessary. Rumors of massacres in Punjab and Bengal came in, choking on every incoming train. On the night when Nehru would soon speak of India's tryst with destiny, Golwalkar sat in a dark room in Nagpur, a lantern throwing hard shadows on the wall. Reports lay scattered before him, villages burned, temples desecrated, trains arriving with doors locked from outside and floors awash with blood. Every page was a wound. He knew what Rahul would be doing that night, probably standing in some crowded square, shoulders held painfully straight despite old prison injuries, eyes shining as the flag climbed the pole, surrounded by people chanting, "Pandit Nehru ki jai." He did not begrudge him that moment. Rahul had paid for it in blood and bone, but he also knew something else. When the cheering died down, when the tricolor fluttered in the morning light over a country split into India and Pakistan, the real battle, the one for the soul, the memory, the identity of the new India, would only just be beginning. Outside, in the clamor of midnight celebrations, firecrackers burst like gunshots. Inside, in the stillness, Golwalkar picked up his pen and underlined a sentence in one of his own notes. Political freedom is but a doorway. The struggle for national character begins now. He had no way of knowing that within 18 months a pistol shot in Delhi would tear through the chest of Mahatma Gandhi, and that the finger of blame, swift and merciless, would swing toward the very organization he was building in the shadows. But he could feel, as he listened to the distant roar of an independent people, that the time he had bargained for on Hedgewar's deathbed was nearly used up. The British were gone. Nehru's India had been born in fireworks and speeches. Now, in the alleys and camps and minds of millions, it was time for Golwalkar's unseen, disciplined counter-India to either rise or be crushed. The bullet that tore through Mahatma Gandhi's chest did something else in the same instant, something invisible but almost as lethal. It ricocheted across newspapers and radio waves and terrified whispers straight into Nagpur and lodged in the heart of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak song. Within hours, the words were everywhere, like a contagious curse. The assassin was one of them. Nathuram Godse, Hindu, Maharashtrian, a man who had once attended shakas, saluted the saffron flag, spoken of Hindu Rashtra. By evening, for millions who did not know the RSS from a school football club, the equation was brutally simple. Gandhi dead. Hindu extremist, RSS. In Delhi, the new government moved with a speed the British Raj might have envied. Intelligence files were pulled. Old reports on uniform drills, on fanatical Hindu youth, were slapped onto desks. Ministers who had barely slept since independence now stared at thin dossiers with fresh, icy attention. One of those ministers was Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, the Iron Man, the Home Minister in charge of internal security. Another, walking the corridors like a ghost, was Jawaharlal Nehru, his face gray, eyes hollowed not only by grief but by a deeper fear that the newborn Indian state might be strangled in its cradle by forces it could not yet control. Somewhere in that building, Rahul, now a young Congress MP, Gandhi's photograph on his desk, still limping slightly from his prison injuries, watched the storm gather and felt a terrible, conflicted surge of emotion, grief for Bapu, and beneath it, an unmistakable calculation. This, he thought, fingers tightening on the window grill, is the moment to finish them. In Nagpur, Golwalkar heard the news in a small, stuffy room, from a trembling Swayamsevak who could barely get the words out. For a long time, Guruji did not speak. The room seemed to shrink around him, the air suddenly heavy. He had disagreed with Gandhi's methods, even his concept of the nation. But Gandhi had been Gandhi, a man whose very name had become shorthand for India in the eyes of the world. To strike him down now in the fragile dawn of freedom was not just murder. It was a signal that the unresolved fury of a broken civilization was spilling out in the ugliest possible way. "Who?" he finally asked. When the name came, his face did not twist, did not collapse. Instead, it hardened into something like stone. Those who were there later remembered that look for the rest of their lives. "He will be used," Golwalkar said quietly, as if speaking to himself, "as the knife with which they try to cut our throat." He had no more than a day to be proved right. On 4 February 1948, the government of India banned the RSS. The words of the order were cold, administrative. Behind them, the reality was anything but. Police jeeps screeched into Shaka grounds at dawn. Saffron flags were snatched down. Bamboo sticks were gathered as evidence of paramilitary activity. Men who had spent their youth drilling in dust now found themselves lined up against walls, searched, cursed at, marched off to crowded jails. In newspaper cartoons, the caricature was immediate and cruel. A bearded fanatic with burning eyes, plotting in the shadows, his hand guiding Godse's pistol. The name Golwalkar, unknown to most Indians only months earlier, now became synonymous in many drawing rooms with the word hate. In Parliament, Rahul rose to his feet, anger and opportunity crackling together in his voice. "Let us be clear," he thundered, fist slamming on the table. "This is not just the act of one madman. This is the inevitable fruit of an ideology that glorifies one community, demonizes others, drills boys with sticks and whispers that they are the only true owners of this land. If we do not crush this poison now, it will grow back again and again." Applause exploded. Some ministers nodded grimly. Others, more cautious, shifted in their seats. In a cramped cell under a sweating tin roof, Golwalkar sat cross-legged on a thin blanket, listening to the distant echoes of that world and feeling, for the second time in his life, that he was standing on the edge of an abyss. Unlike Rahul, he had never been a prisoner of the British. His first taste of jail came bitterly under his own country's flag. Letters, smuggled in through sympathetic warders, painted a rapidly darkening picture. Shakas broken up, property seized, workers beaten. Families taunted in markets as killers of Gandhi. Some Swayamsevaks, terrified, drifted away. Others stayed defiant and waited. The ban might last months, or it might last forever. In the outside world, a clock started ticking, not for the fall of an empire, as Hedgewar had once warned, but for the possible extinction of the organization that had been built to deal with that fall. If the government could keep the RSS underground for 5-10 years, if boys grew up hearing only one story, that those people killed Gandhi, then all the discipline, all the midnight journeys, all the training in character would sink without a trace, like a stone thrown into a black lake. Inside the jail, Golwalkar asked for only one thing: books, scriptures, history, newspapers, when he could get them. And when trusted visitors were allowed, he asked for one more thing: reports. "Where are the men?" he would ask, voice low but urgent. "Are they breaking? Are they giving in to anger? Are there any temptations toward violence?" The answers mattered more than food. For if even a handful of enraged Swayamsevaks lashed out, burned a mosque, attacked a Muslim neighbor in the name of revenge, the government would have all the justification it needed to keep the ban in place permanently. The war now was not on streets, but inside chests. Outside the prison walls, an unlikely drama unfolded. In his own way, Sardar Patel had as much reason as Rahul to hate what the RSS symbolized. As Home Minister, he had seen intelligence reports, heard of inflammatory speeches, felt the murderous wind that had swept through the subcontinent since partition. Yet he was also a lawyer, a realist, a man who understood that you could not arrest an idea, you could only contain it or drive it deeper. Senior RSS workers, taking enormous personal risks, sought meetings with him. "We did not kill Gandhi," they insisted. "Many of us admired him, even when we disagreed. Guruji had no role in this crime. Punish the guilty, but do not smother millions because of one man's bullets." Patel was not sentimental. He was, however, shrewd enough to recognize something it would take his colleagues longer to admit: that the song was now too large. too entrenched in the social fabric to erase with one government order. But if he was to lift the ban, he wanted terms. There would be no more secrecy, no more half-hidden command structures. The RSS must adopt a written constitution, open its doors to inspection, formally renounce participation in electoral politics, accept the sovereignty of the Indian constitution. In other words, come out of the shadows or stay outlawed forever. It took 18 months of back and forth, of suspicion, of surveillance, of pressure from Congress hawks like Rahul who hissed in closed-door meetings. They are only pretending to be harmless. Give them 10 years and they will be back in every village, preaching that the state you are building is a fraud. In his cell, Golwalkar received Patel's conditions in the cramped handwriting of a trusted emissary. To some, they might have looked like humiliation, a surrender, a demand that the lion shave its mane and walk on a leash. He read them in silence, eyes moving slowly, once, twice, 3 times. Then, after a long pause, he spoke words that shocked even his own closest followers. "We will agree." The emissary stared. "But Guruji—" "It is better," Golwalkar said, "for us to sign a document and return to society than to sit in here polishing our pride while the next generation grows up without us. What is paper in front of 1,000 years of work?" He understood something that many revolutionaries never learn, that surviving into the next phase of history sometimes required the swallowing of today's anger. On 11th July 1949, the ban on the RSS was lifted. Golwalkar walked out of jail into a blinding white afternoon, thinner, grayer, beard longer, but eyes burning with a new, almost frightening intensity. He had lost 18 months of the most critical period in independent India's infancy. Nehru's government had used that time to plant its own narrative in schools, radio, bureaucracy, secular democracy, scientific temper, socialism. He now had to make up for that lost time, fast. At the first large gathering of Swayamsevaks after the ban, he did something unexpected. He did not rant about injustice. He did not curse Nehru or Rahul. Instead, standing before thousands of men who had tasted the bitterness of being branded traitors to their own nation, he raised his voice just enough to cut through the murmurs. "History has tested us," he said. "We were accused of the worst crime a patriot can imagine. We have been spat upon in the streets. Some among us wavered, many did not. Now, if we waste one more day in self-pity, we will prove our enemies right." He paused, letting the words sink in. "From this moment, the ban is behind us. Our answer to slander will not be court cases and press statements. Our answer will be work. Work, and something else." In jail, staring at blank walls, he had come to a stark conclusion. So long as the Sangh remained a single, easily targeted body, the state could crush it with a single blow. But if the same spirit flowed through many organizations, youth, students, labor, culture, politics, then even if one arm was shackled, the others could move. An organism not with one visible head, but with many nerves. Thus began quietly the construction of what would later be called the Sangh Parivar, the family of organizations. In 1949, inspired by Guruji's call to reach the campuses where independent India's future elite was forming, a few young teachers and Swayamsevak started the Akhil Bharatiya Vidyarthi Parishad, a student organization that married nationalist rhetoric with campus activism. In 1951, in smoky late-night discussions in Delhi drawing rooms, Golwalkar met Syama Prasad Mukherjee, a former minister disillusioned with Nehru's policies, especially on Kashmir. The meeting was almost cinematic. Golwalkar in simple clothes, eyes calm but incisive. Mukherjee, educated, articulate, carrying the polish of the capital. Between them lay maps, newspaper clippings, bitter memories of partition. "You say you will not do politics," Mukherjee challenged. "Yet you are everywhere, in villages, in mines. If we are to challenge Congress and Parliament, we need your strength." Golwalkar's reply was precise. "The Sangh as such will not contest elections. That is our discipline. But if men who have been trained in our shakas choose to work in a political party devoted to national interest, we will not stop them." From that conversation, and others like it, emerged the Bharatiya Jana Sangh, the first organized political expression of the ideology Guruji had been nurturing in the shadows since the 1930s. Rahul watched its birth with a mix of contempt and unease. From the Congress benches, he mocked them as men in khaki shorts who think they can run a country with drill whistles and slogans. But when Jana Sangh candidates began to win pockets of votes in urban North India, when their speeches about appeasement and forgotten, Hindus drew real crowds, the unease grew. At the same time, the song extended its reach into labor with the Bharatiya Mazdoor song, into tribal areas with the Vanavasi Kalyan ashram, and in 1964 into the very heart of Hindu religious life with the creation of the Vishva Hindu Parishad. Each new organization had its own leaders, its own banners, but somewhere behind them, like a quiet gravitational pull, stood the thin, bearded figure whose name rarely appeared in headlines, but whose influence threaded through them all. M.S. Golwalkar. All this expansion might have remained a footnote in Indian history if not for the next great shock. In October 1962, Chinese troops poured over the Himalayan border. For years, Nehru had spoken of Hindi Chini bye-bye, brothers in Asian solidarity. Now Indian soldiers retreated in disarray, outgunned, under-equipped, dying in icy desolation. The proud, newly independent state suddenly looked fragile, almost naked. In towns and cities, panic and shame converged. For the first time since 1947, the moral authority of Nehru's government trembled. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. Across the country, RSS Swayamsevaks reported to local authorities, offering themselves for civil defense, traffic control, relief, work, anything that would free up soldiers and administration for the front. In Delhi, on certain mornings, the sight was startling even to hardened bureaucrats. Rows of young men in khaki shorts and white shirts, and moving with drilled efficiency, taking charges at ration shops, crowd management, first aid posts. Some Congress leaders, still nursing the old suspicions, were furious. Are we now to thank those who opposed Quit India, Rahul snapped in one closed meeting, for helping us while we face a foreign enemy? This is hypocrisy, not patriotism. But Nehru, battered by the war's humiliation, exhausted by cabinet quarrels, made a decision that no one in 1948 would have imagined. In 1963, as a gesture of appreciation for their wartime service, the government allowed an RSS contingent to march in the Republic Day parade in New Delhi. The image was like a crack in a wall of certainty. Under the winter sun, in perfect step, the same men who had once been banned as dangerous fascist marched down Rajpath, saluting the very state that had tried to suffocate them. On the reviewing stand, Nehru watched, face unreadable. Somewhere in the crowd, Rahul stood rigid, jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. For millions of Indians seeing the khaki-clad column on radio in newsreel footage at cinema halls, a question whispered at the edges of awareness. If they were truly enemies of India, why are they here? In Nagpur, Golwalkar listened to reports of the parade with the faintest of smiles, not triumph, not revenge. Something quieter, more dangerous to his opponents. The satisfaction of a man seeing a long, patient strategy just begin to pierce the fog. Yet he allowed himself no illusions. Within a year, Nehru was dead. A mourning nation watched his funeral pyre blaze by the Yamuna. For Rahul, who had tied his entire political identity to Nehruvian ideals, it felt like losing both a leader and a protective shield. For Golwalkar, hearing the news in a remote town, the moment was more complex. The rival he had shadowboxed with for decades, sometimes by name, more often as an idea, was gone. But the state Nehru had built, the bureaucracy steeped in his language of secularism and socialism, remained. Men die, he told a closed gathering of senior prakaraks. Systems live on. Do not think our work is easier now. In some ways, it has only become harder. A fatherless house is easier for us to enter, but also easier for new enemies to take. By the late 1960s, Golwalkar's own body had begun to show the strain of his chosen life: endless travel, sleepless nights in third-class compartments, dust, bad food, constant meetings. Doctors hinted at heart trouble, at the need for rest, for discipline of another kind. He brushed them aside, but not without inward calculation. If I am lucky, he is said to have remarked wryly to an old comrade, I have 10 years before this machine gives out. In those 10 years, we must do work that others would plan for 50. After that, all is in the hands of the society we have shaped. 10 years. In that narrow window, the song strengthened its hold in the Hindi heartland, spread tentatively into the south and northeast, deepened its roots in student, labor, and religious life. The Jana song, though still far from power, began to look less like an eccentric fringe and more like a serious opposition in several states. Rahul, older, more tired, watched the saffron-tinted presents grow in places where once only the Congress flag had flown unchallenged. In private, he admitted to a colleague, "We thought the ban of 48 would bury them. Instead, it baptized them. They thrive on adversity. If the day comes when democracy itself is in danger, mark my words, they will be among the first to step forward with that maddening calm of theirs and say, 'We are ready.'" He had no idea how soon his prediction would be tested. In 1971, as war with Pakistan loomed again and millions of refugees poured into India from East Bengal, fleeing slaughter, burning homes, violated women, RSS Swayamsevaks once again appeared at border camps, railway stations, relief kitchens. They carried sacks of grain, dug latrines, organized queues, soothed terrified children. They did it under the same flag that fluttered in their morning drills and under the tricolor that flew from government buildings. For the refugees in tattered saris and ragged dhotis, labels didn't matter. The man who brought water, who helped them bury their dead, who found a lost child and returned him to his mother, that man was on their side. From his increasingly fragile body, Golwalkar watched this dance of disaster and service and politics with eyes that had seen his country under an empire, under partition, under ban, under war. The rivalry that had once been between a young zoology lecturer and a charismatic student named Rahul, then between Guruji and Nehru, had now become something vaster and more impersonal, a struggle between two visions of what India could be. On one side, the sovereign state with its planning commission graphs, its 5-year plans, its treaties and non-aligned speeches. On the other, a slowly weaving web of discipline and identity, stretching shaka by shaka, student by student, refugee by refugee, into a shape no one had fully grasped yet. As the 1970s began and whispers of political crisis, corruption, and unrest grew louder in Delhi's corridors, Golwalkar knew one thing with a biologist's cold clarity. Storms were coming, storms that could blow away not just governments but the very safeguards of democracy Nehru had sworn to build. By then, his own heart ticked with an unpredictable rhythm, sometimes stumbling, sometimes racing. Yet, night after night, bent over maps and reports, he kept returning to the same quiet, relentless question. When the next great test comes, will the organism we have built respond like a scattered crowd or like a single disciplined body? The answer to that question would not fully reveal itself until after his own body had failed. But for now, in those tense twilight years, as another deadline approached, not of empires or bans, but of his own mortality, M.S. Golwalkar drove himself and his cadre harder than ever, determined to leave behind not just followers, but a force that could outlive its creator and outlast its oldest rival. When his heart finally misfired, a tiny spasm in a tired muscle inside a thin, bearded chest, some people in Delhi uncorked a quiet bottle of whiskey. "Relax," they told each other, half joking, half relieved. "The Guruji is gone. Without him, this whole thing will shrink back to size." They were certain of one thing. Dead men do not win elections. Dead men do not pull down mosques. Dead men do not change the future map of a country. They were wrong on all three counts. In the last years of his life, M.S. Golwalkar moved through India like a man racing two invisible clocks at once. One was obvious, the erratic beat of his heart. Doctors in Nagpur, Delhi, Varanasi repeated the same verdict in different accents. "Rest, Guruji, slow down, fewer tours. No more 3 speeches a day." He nodded politely. Then he boarded another overnight train. The second clock was not in his chest but in the air around him. Student unrest in universities, strikes in factories, whispered corruption scandals. A sharper, more unforgiving tone in Indira Gandhi's speeches as she fought battles inside and outside her party. He could smell it the way a zoologist smells the first rot in a specimen jar, the tang of a democracy beginning to sour. "If the state feels weak," he told a closed meeting of Prakaraks in 1972, "its first instinct is not humility, it is control. Be ready." They stared at him, sweat shining on their faces in the cramped hall. "Ready for what?" someone asked. "For a time," he said quietly, "when the law will be used not to protect but to pinch the throat. Maybe not tomorrow, but sooner than they think. And sooner, perhaps, than this body will allow me to see." The room fell still. It was the nearest he ever came in public to admitting he might not be there when the next storm broke. Under that shadow, he made 3 urgent moves. First, he intensified the internal discipline of the RSS. Morning shakas were drilled harder. Training camp sharpened not only physical exercises but secrecy, communication, living off almost nothing. He began to speak with deliberate repetition of the virtues of silence, patience, underground work. Obey the law, he would say. But if the day comes when the law itself becomes unjust, remember, an organization is not a shop that closes when the police lock the door. It is a will that finds new forms. Second, he turned to succession. For years, rumors had swirled, who after Guruji? In an outfit with no elections, no posters of leaders, the choice mattered even more. Some favored a hardline organizer from the north, a man whose anger at partition still burned visibly in his eyes. Others whispered about a smoother, more political figure who could talk to businessmen and saints with equal ease. Golwalkar listened, measured, and over time began to lean more visibly on one man, Madhukar Balasaheb Deoras. Deoras was very unlike his predecessor in temperament. Shorter, stockier, more approachable, with a capacity for small talk that Guruji never pretended to have. Where Golwalkar thought in civilizational centuries, Deoras thought in election cycles and legislative sessions. They argued gently but intensely in late-night meetings. We cannot remain only in lanes and playgrounds, Deoras insisted. If we want to shape this nation, we must dirty our feet in the mud of actual politics, farmer agitations, slums, not just sermons on culture. And we will, Guruji replied. But remember, the core must remain outside party games. Parties come and go. We are building something that must outlive every ministry. See, outsiders would later assume the RSS chose successors like a secret conclave choosing a pope. Inside, the reality was more human. Hesitations, misgivings, reassurances. In the end, what swung it was not just Deoras's organizational talent, but something else. He understood more than most the weight of the coming confrontation with the state. Third, Golwalkar began to address with unusual frankness a topic he had often ducked in public, his own image. He disliked personality cults. Photos of him were discouraged in shakas. His birthday was to be just another working day, yet, in spite of his efforts, a quiet aura had grown around Guruji that made some younger Swayamsevaks speak his name with almost mystical reverence. He found it dangerous. On a cold winter morning, addressing a group of senior workers in Delhi, he gestured impatiently at a garlanded photo of himself on the wall. "Take that down," he snapped. "If your loyalty is to this face, then when this face disappears, your work will end. Remember this well. The saying has no indispensable man, not even me." He said it as a warning. For some, it became a prophecy. In 1973, the warnings of the doctors finally overtook his stubbornness. Chest pains that had been occasional became frequent visitors. A coughing fit left blood on his handkerchief. He would, annoyingly to himself, run out of breath halfway through a sentence and have to pause while his audience watched, frozen, until his lungs cooperated again. On one such evening in Nagpur, as he struggled for air, Balasaheb Deoras rose instinctively, hand outstretched. "Sit, Guruji," he said softly. "We can continue tomorrow." Golwalkar looked up at him, eyes suddenly clear, a thin smile tugging at his beard. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "is for you." A few months later, on 5th of June 1973, the second clock stopped. He died not in a battlefield or a prison, but in a modest room, under a fan that wobbled slightly, surrounded by men who had given their youth to an idea that now had to learn to breathe without its most recognizable voice. The news broke at first in whispers. By evening, thousands were on the move. They came from small towns whose names never made it to newspapers, from college hostels, from ashrams, from the back rows of bus depots where Swayamsevaks often held tiny late-night meetings. Some traveled for hours just to stand for a few seconds near his lifeless body, hands trembling in namaste. In Nagpur, the line of mourners stretched and coiled like a human river. Many wept. Others stood dry-eyed, fists clenched, as if making some private vow. In Delhi, an aging Rahul watched the brief television footage, jaw set. He had imagined this scene more than once, in secret. He had thought, even hoped, that when the bearded figure finally lay still, the spell would break, that the khaki shorts and sticks would fade back into an eccentric footnote of post-independence history. But as the camera panned over the scale of the grief, the sheer variety of faces, from scholars to rickshaw pullers, something cold slipped down his spine. This, he admitted reluctantly to himself, alone in his study, is no longer about one man. Within hours of the cremation, the song moved with a swiftness that would have startled many political parties. There was no public succession drama, no leaking of rival letters. The announcement was simple, almost austere. Balasaheb Dioras would now be Sarsangchalak. For the first time in its history, the RSS was led not by a man who had been shaped by the freedom struggle, but by one whose formative years had been spent entirely inside a free India. The difference would soon matter. Under Dioras, the network that Golwalkar had built, shakas, student wings, labor unions, religious forums, did not just hum along, it began to push more deliberately into mass politics. Song activists turned up at slum demolitions, protesting alongside leftists. They helped organize anti-price rise agitations, farmer rallies, language protests. The Jana Sangh, which had once seemed like a polite debating society for middle-class Hindus, sharpened its elbows on the street. From his grave, as it were, Golwalkar's organism was learning new reflexes. And then the storm he had predicted broke. On the night of 25 June 1975, the Prime Minister went on radio. Emergency. In one word, the Constitution bent like hot metal. Fundamental rights were suspended. Opposition leaders were picked up in midnight swoops. Newspapers woke up to find censors sitting in their newsrooms, blue pencils ready. Slum dwellers were herded like cattle into sterilization camps. Courts, cowed or complicit, looked away. For Rahul, it was an almost unbearable irony. He had spent his youth fighting an empire that jailed dissenters. Now, in his old age, he watched his own party replicate the same reflexes in the name of saving democracy. He opposed it in private, argued in internal meetings, warned of long-term damage. But his voice, once thunder in the Lok Sabha, was now a tired rumble, easily drowned by the machinery of power. For the RSS, the emergency was both a nightmare and a test they had been unconsciously preparing for since 1948. Within days, the organization was banned again. Dioras himself was arrested. Thousands of Swayamsevaks found themselves in the same jails where their ideological enemies now occupied neighboring cells. On paper, it looked like a replay of the Gandhi assassination crackdown. In practice, it played out very differently. First, the RSS was no longer an isolated suspect. It was one among many targets: socialists, communists, Gandhian Sarvodaya workers, student leaders, all tasted the same bitter metal cup. Second, the web Golwalkar had spun across society meant that the ban could not fully sever their connections. Doctors who were Swayamsevaks treated injured student protesters and passed messages in code. Shopkeepers hid cyclo-style machines in back rooms to print underground pamphlets. Temple courtyards became delivery points for banned literature. Train compartments turned into brief fleeting headquarters as prakaraks, wanted by the police, changed locations more frequently than their shirts. They were careful. No pointless bravado, no suicidal street fights. But slowly, silently, they stitched themselves to other wounded parts of the body politic. A socialist organizer in Bihar would later recall, half admiring, half wary, when the RSS men said they would deliver 5,000 posters overnight, we laughed. We thought, these khaki-short people, what do they know of secret work? The next morning, every wall from Patna to the next district was plastered. No one had seen them do it. That discipline, it chilled me. From behind bars, Dioras made a move that Golwalkar, with his instinctive distance from the system, might never have attempted. He wrote letters to the Prime Minister, couched in respectful language but unflinching in content, criticizing the emergency and offering the cooperation of the RSS, if democratic norms were restored. To some in the underground, the letters smelled of compromise. Dioras, however, understood something crucial. Even as they resisted, they had to position themselves in the public memory not as anarchists but as guardians of a violated constitution. When the emergency finally cracked, under the combined weight of international pressure, internal dissent, and Indira Gandhi's own miscalculations, and elections were announced in 1977, the organism answered the signal like a body whose nerve endings had all been jolted at once. Across North India, RSS workers poured quietly into the campaign of the Janata Party, the broad anti-Congress coalition. They knocked on doors, manned booths, trained novices in how to handle voter lists and counting centers. In the euphoric days after Janata's shock victory and the fall of Indira, many journalists noted with surprise the efficient presence of khaki-clad men in government offices advising newly minted ministers on everything from files to flags. For Rahul, it was a bitter vindication of his old fears. Over tea with a younger colleague, he muttered, "We thought emergency would squeeze them out of politics. Instead, we handed them a certificate of martyrdom and a ladder into the center of power." Yet the Janata experiment contained its own twist. Within a few years, torn apart by infighting and ideological contradictions, the government collapsed. One of the sharpest fractures was over the dual membership issue. Could ministers loyal to the RSS continue to serve both the state and a non-state body? When forced to choose, many walked back into the Sangh's embrace. From that rubble, in 1980, the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, was born, a new political vehicle, more polished, more carefully branded. But drawing from the same well of shakas and prakaraks that Golwalkar had once quietly nurtured, its early years were modest, its rhetoric coded in words like Gandhian socialism, but by the mid-1980s, another current surged to the surface. The question of a disputed mosque in Ayodhya, believed by many Hindus to stand on the birthplace of Lord Rama. As the BJP and allied organizations took up the Ram Janmabhoomi cause, something unmistakably Golwalkarian slipped into the public vocabulary. Talk of historical wrongs, of a Hindu majority taught to be ashamed of itself, of secularism as a one-way street where only one community was asked to yield. Phrases from Bunch of Thoughts began to echo, sometimes almost word for word, in speeches that now blared from loudspeakers on jeeps, and not just from makeshift stages at shakas. Rahul, now retired from public life, watched on television as L.K. Advani's motorized Rath Yatra wound through towns draped in saffron, drawing crowds that no Janasangh candidate of his youth could have dreamed of. In one frame, he saw something that made his hand tighten on the armrest. Behind the politician on the chariot, half covered by garlands, was a portrait of a thin, bearded man with intense eyes. M.S. Golwalkar, dead nearly 2 decades, was back in the frame. The events that followed shocked even many who had cheered the rhetoric. The demolition of the Babri Masjid in 1992, the riots that scarred cities, the widening crack in India's social fabric, all of it stained in the minds of critics. Not just the Kar Sevaks on the dome, but the ideology that had helped legitimize talk of reclaiming and correcting history. Yet, even as intellectuals and human rights activists held up passages from We or Our Nationhood Defined and Bunch of Thoughts to argue that the seeds of exclusion and dominance were always there, millions of others saw something very different when they looked at the same life. They saw the man who had insisted on daily discipline when the country slept in fatalism, the organizer whose volunteers had turned up with blankets and floods, with food and famine, with notebooks in villages where no government teacher had set foot, the thinker who had spoken in unfashionable tones about cultural self-confidence at a time when Western models dazzled the new elite. In university seminars, a new generation argued fiercely. A young historian flipped through a photocopied chapter from Bunch of Thoughts, voice shaking with anger as she read aloud the categorization of Muslims and Christians as internal threats. "Can you not see," she demanded of her classmate across the table, "how this language dehumanizes, how it makes violence thinkable?" Her opponent, himself a former Swayamsevak, shot back, "And can you not see," he asked, "how for decades the majority was told that any talk of its own identity was communal? Guruji gave us a vocabulary to push back. Why are only his sins remembered, not his service?" In that clash of interpretations, the ghost of Golwalkar sat silently, unerased, uncanonized, argued over like a stubborn fact in a thesis no one could agree on. By the late 1990s, when the BJP finally led a coalition government at the center under Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the organism had completed a circle that would have seemed fantastical in the 1940s. A pracharak trained in the morning chill of a shaka now stood at Red Fort reading the Independence Day speech. Ministers trooped to Nagpur to pay courtesy calls, posing for photos under the saffron flag that had once flown nervously in empty fields. To Rahul's grandchildren, watching this new India on color television, the old stories of the 1948 ban sounded almost unbelievable. "Dada," one of them teased him gently at a family gathering. "You used to call them fascists, nah? Now everyone wears saffron on television, even film stars. Maybe you just lost the argument." He smiled thinly, eyes distant. "This argument," he said, tapping his chest, "is not yet over. In 2014, when another former Pracharak, Narendra Modi, rose from the dust and blood of Gujarat politics to become prime minister with a majority no non-Congress party had ever achieved, the sense of a long game reaching fruition became impossible to ignore, even for those who recoiled from it. Here was a man who wore his association with the RSS openly, who visited its headquarters in Nagpur not as a supplicant to a secret power but as a son returning to his first school. Policies on cow slaughter, on history textbooks, on cultural institutions began, in the eyes of critics, to echo long-held Sangh priorities. At the same time, the organization continued its quiet work in thousands of towns and villages, running schools, hostels, service projects, often invisible to television cameras that focused only on controversies. The contradictions multiplied. In 2019, the Supreme Court's verdict clearing the way for a Ram temple in Ayodhya was greeted by millions as a long-awaited closure to a wound festering since before they were born. At the same time, others saw in the celebrations the final triumph of a politics that had begun decades earlier with slogans about cultural pride and ended with a mosque reduced to rubble. Through it all, the slender figure who had once walked village paths with a cloth bag over his shoulder remained both central and strangely absent. No official portrait in Parliament. No postage stamp for many years. His books, when reprinted, often came with forewords softening or contextualizing his harshest lines. His defenders quoted his calls for social harmony, his critics his dark warnings about minorities. The rivalry that had begun between a shy zoology teacher turned ascetic organizer and the secular nationalist establishment of his time had, by the early 21st century, morphed into a confrontation between two common senses in India. One side said religion and nation must be kept politely separate, at least in law and policy. The state must bend over backwards to reassure minorities. The other, steeped consciously or unconsciously in Golwalkar's idiom, replied, culture and nation are inseparable, majority identity cannot always retreat without becoming hollow. The years did not resolve the question. They sharpened it. And somewhere under a tree in a dusty ground at dawn, a whistle blows. Boys and young men fall into lines, raise their arms in a familiar salute to a saffron flag. Few of them have read We or Our Nationhood Defined. Fewer still could recite a page of Bunch of Thoughts. For them, Guruji is a face on a poster, a story in a training camp, a nickname used with a mixture of awe and casualness. But when they shout in unison, when they march in step, when they are told that they belong not just to a club but to a civilization, under siege and renewal they are entering a stream that began to be channeled, stone by patient stone, by a man who once sat on the floor of a prison cell asking for books and wondering if the organism he was tending would outlive his own frail body. Half a century after his death, the answer is written not in marble statues or official memorials, but in something far more unsettling for his old rivals. It is written in the fact that you cannot walk through the politics of modern India, its elections, its riots, its relief camps, its classrooms, its arguments over who we really are, without stumbling again and again over the long, thin shadow of M. Golwalkar.